Part 1/8, the mission that started like any other. For the men aboard this B-17, the day began in a way that felt almost routine. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar. A wartime airfield has its own rhythm. Engines coughing into life, ground crews shouting over prop noise, the smell of fuel and oil hanging in the cold air. The crew walked around the bomber with practiced focus, checking panels, inspecting tires, looking for anything that might turn a hard day into a dead one. A B-17 was not a small machine. It was a flying structure of aluminum, rivets, hydraulics, cables, and human trust. Every role mattered because every system depended on another. The pilot and co-pilot had the yoke and throttle, but the aircraft was held together by the work of everyone: navigator, bombardier, radio operator, gunners, each with a station, each trained to do one job extremely well. Once airborne, the aircraft climbed in stages, joining its formation as it gained altitude. Up there, with the world shrinking beneath cloud layers and haze, it was easy to forget how thin the margin really was. A formation of bombers looked powerful in the distance, but inside each aircraft, it was still just a handful of men, strapped into metal, heading into airspace that had been designed to kill them. The crew settled into mission mode. It wasn't courage in the cinematic sense. It was discipline. They watched their instruments, kept their headings, listened for commands, and waited for the moment when the target area would appear. For the bombardier in the nose, the forward view was everything. Through the glass panels of the front compartment, he watched the sky for fighters and the ground for landmarks. This position gave the clearest visibility, but it also carried the quiet knowledge that if anything came forward, flak, debris, a sudden impact, the nose would take it first. Anti-aircraft fire began as it often did, distant bursts, black puffs of smoke opening around the formation like flowers that weren't meant to be beautiful. The aircraft trembled gently when shock waves passed nearby. The crew had heard it all before. You could be inches from death and still keep doing math, still call out altitude, still check temperatures. That was how you survived long enough to get home. But sometimes the difference between nearby and direct was a few feet. Sometimes the sky chose a target. Without warning, a blast erupted in front of the aircraft, with a violence so immediate it felt unreal. It wasn't a clean punch or a single hole. It was as if the airplane had been edited. One frame intact, the next frame missing. The front of the bomber was torn away, the glass and metal of the nose compartment shredded and ripped backward by the slipstream. In an instant, the bombardier's world vanished. The aircraft's forward structure, normally a sealed space, became open sky. Wind slammed into the fuselage like a solid object. Loose equipment, papers, and fragments were pulled violently rearward. Cold air flooded in with a roar so loud it swallowed intercom voices and turned the cockpit into a screaming tunnel. The pilots felt the aircraft lurch. The yoke pulled hard, the bomber yawing and pitching as airflow struck surfaces never meant to be exposed. Gauges flickered. Alarms or warning lights appeared where they shouldn't. The pilot's first thought was not a heroic line. It was shock, then a reflex. Keep the wings from rolling, keep the nose from dropping too fast, keep the bomber from tearing itself apart. This kind of damage was not a partial failure. It was the kind of hit that usually ended a flight in seconds. Yet the B-17 stayed in the air. For a brief moment, nobody moved. not because they were calm, but because their brains were trying to match reality to training. The airplane had just lost its entire front section, and it was still flying. That fact did not make sense. And then the crew did what airmen do when the impossible happens. They stopped asking why and started asking what comes next. And then the crew did what airmen do when the impossible happens. They stopped asking why and started asking what comes next. Part 2/8. We're still flying doesn't mean we're okay. The first seconds after the blast were pure instability. The aircraft didn't behave like a damaged airplane. It behaved like a machine that had lost its assumptions. Airflow was no longer smooth along the fuselage. It was slamming into torn edges and internal framework, creating violent buffeting that shook the entire bomber. In the cockpit, the pilot fought the controls with measured force. Too much input could worsen the oscillation. Too little input could let the bomber roll into a dive. The co-pilot scanned the instruments and then the physical environment, trying to figure out what had actually happened. A normal aircraft gives clues: smoke, alarms, a shift in trim. Here the clue was almost absurd: daylight, where there should have been structure. They could see forward through a jagged opening. No glass, no nose, no clean edge, just exposed metal and open sky. The roar of wind was so loud it made communication feel like trying to talk inside a storm drain. Even breathing felt different, colder and sharper. Crew members behind them shouted into the intercom, asking who was hit, what was gone, what was still there. Some voices responded quickly, others did not. The absence of a reply carried a weight that no one wanted to name out loud. Then another detail became terrifyingly clear. Control systems that normally lived inside the aircraft were now exposed. The B-17's control cables, linkages, and lines, mechanical connections that translated pilot movement into rudder and elevator response, were visible, not neatly. They were visible because the airplane's skin had been torn off around them. Some of those cables were whipping and vibrating in the slipstream. Any one of them snapping could mean the loss of a control surface. Any one of them tangling could jam movement. The plane was flying on borrowed time. The instinctive procedure for catastrophic structural damage was straightforward: bailout. Crews trained for that. They knew the motions, the steps, the timing. But training also taught something else. You don't abandon an aircraft the moment it's hurt, if it's still controllable, because the moment you leave it, you trade one set of dangers for another. And below them was the worst alternative: enemy territory. A parachute descent into that landscape didn't guarantee survival. It often guaranteed capture, injury, or worse. The crew had to make a brutal calculation in real time. The pilots tested the controls carefully. Tiny adjustments, slow changes. The airplane responded, but sluggishly. It also hunted in the air, drifting left, then correcting right, like a wounded animal trying to keep balance. The pilot reduced power slightly to calm the aircraft down, because speed would make the wind more violent, more destructive. But speed also kept lift stable. Everything was trade-offs. Behind the cockpit, someone moved forward, bracing against bulkheads, trying to see what could be done. This wasn't standard procedure. Nobody trains for grab exposed control lines while the airplane is in flight. But the crew could see the problem. The slipstream was attacking the very mechanism that kept them alive. So they improvised. They used hands, grips, and whatever stable anchor points existed to steady the most violently thrashing lines, just enough to prevent catastrophic whipping. It wasn't a fix. It was a temporary stabilization. Up front, the pilots felt a subtle change. The bomber still shook, still screamed, still felt wrong, but it became slightly more predictable, slightly more manageable. And in aviation, manageable is the difference between a controlled descent and a fatal spin. The crew then faced a second reality. They could not stay at bombing altitude. High altitude meant thinner air, narrower margins, and punishing cold flooding through the open fuselage. Fingers would numb, vision would blur, decision-making would slow. They needed denser air, warmer air, and a wider safety margin. But descending meant going lower into the range where enemy weapons and fighters could reach them more easily. Staying high meant risking loss of control due to cold, vibration, and structural stress. They chose to descend. Carefully. No dive. No steep pitch changes. A slow, measured descent designed to keep airspeed under control. And as they began that descent, the crew realized something else. The 10 minutes people later talked about wasn't a dramatic exaggeration. It was the amount of time it took for the crew to prove the plane could be kept under control at all. If they could survive those 10 minutes, they might have a chance at the hours that followed. Part 3/8. Keep it alive, then get it home. Once the aircraft stabilized enough for the crew to think beyond the immediate crisis, the situation became a different kind of emergency. Not a single event, but a long sequence of risks. They were still deep in hostile territory. The formation had moved on. The bomber was now a wounded straggler, separated from protection and far from friendly airfields. The pilot and co-pilot reduced the workload by prioritizing only what mattered. Maintain control, manage speed, manage altitude. Everything else, comfort, mission objectives, even some standard checklists, was secondary. The navigator, if he could still function at his station, had to figure out a route home that minimized exposure. A straight line was not always the safest line. Communication remained difficult because of the wind. Even the intercom, designed for noisy environments, struggled against the raw roar of air rushing through the missing front. The crew adapted by using short phrases and confirmations. Long explanations were impossible. The noise swallowed them. The co-pilot called out airspeed and altitude changes. The pilot responded with minimal words. The crew behind them relayed status updates, systems responding, injuries, damage observations. They worked like a team that had been forced into a new version of its own job. The aircraft's behavior changed as it descended. Denser air gave better control authority, but it also increased the physical force of wind hitting the torn structure. The open front became a scoop, catching air and turning it into pressure and vibration. The bomber shook in a deeper, heavier way, like it was being pushed rather than merely buffeted. The pilot had to find a speed sweet spot, fast enough to stay stable, slow enough to avoid ripping away more structure. This was not something a manual could provide. It was something you felt, minute by minute, through the yoke and the airframe. Crew members who had moved toward the exposed area continued to monitor the control lines. Their job was to reduce hazards that could become fatal without warning. A cable that starts whipping harder. A loose piece of metal beginning to flap. A fragment, shifting into a dangerous position. In an intact aircraft, these problems are hidden. In this aircraft, they were visible and immediate. And then the bomber drifted farther away from any other aircraft. That isolation carried a psychological cost. A formation feels like a moving fortress. Alone, you feel like a single target. Even if enemy fighters never appear, the possibility stays in your mind like static. The crew kept scanning the sky. Gunners watched their arcs. The radio operator, if his equipment still worked reliably, tried to contact friendly channels, or at least listen for guidance. In the chaos, radio reception could be weak, and the open fuselage did the crew no favors. But they kept trying because information was another form of protection. Over time, the bomber's movement became steadier. Not normal, never normal, but steadier. The pilot could hold a rough heading without fighting constant swings. The co-pilot could help trim out some instability. The aircraft became, in a limited way, a controllable machine again. That's when the crew confronted the next major decision. Do we commit to staying with the aircraft all the way, or do we bail out now, while it's still stable? Bailing out is not a neutral choice. It involves opening hatches, moving through cramped compartments, jumping into violent wind, deploying a parachute, and hoping you land somewhere you can survive. Injuries were common, even when everything went right. And here, with the aircraft's structure compromised, movement itself could be dangerous. Staying with the aircraft meant betting that the bomber could remain intact long enough to reach friendly territory and land. That bet was not guaranteed. It was a risk that would stretch over miles and hours. The crew chose to stay because the alternative was worse. With that decision made, they moved into a sustained survival mode. Manage fuel. Keep engines steady. Avoid sharp maneuvers. Descend to a safer altitude. Take the longest, safest path if needed. And above all, keep the aircraft calm, because a stressed airframe fails quickly. People often ask after stories like this, what kept them going? The answer is rarely a single thing. It's training, yes. It's teamwork, yes. It's luck, yes. But it's also something quieter, a refusal to let panic write the next sentence. The crew didn't win the moment the nose was blown off. They earned small seconds, then small minutes, then longer stretches of time, each one paid for with focus and restraint. And slowly, painfully, the bomber crawled toward home. Part 4/8. The airplane fought them the whole way. As the aircraft continued, the crew learned that the biggest enemy wasn't always bullets or flak. Sometimes it was the airplane itself, not because it wanted to fail, but because damage changes physics. The B-17 was now flying with a broken aerodynamic shape. Air didn't flow around it the way designers intended. It crashed into edges, created turbulence in new places, and amplified every gust. At times, the bomber vibrated with a harsh resonance that felt like it was coming from deep inside the structure. The pilot had to recognize those moments and respond with calm. Reduce speed slightly, stabilize attitude, avoid sudden corrections. Every action had a consequence. The co-pilot continued to monitor engine health. Losing an engine on a B-17 was survivable in some cases. Losing an engine on a B-17 with its nose missing and stability compromised was a different equation. So they kept the engines running smoothly, avoiding overheat, avoiding aggressive throttle movements. The navigator worked with limited tools. Navigation in wartime bombers relied on instruments, dead reckoning, landmarks, and calculations. Methods that assume you can maintain headings and timing. In a damaged bomber, headings might drift. Wind might push you more than expected. So the navigator had to build a plan that allowed for uncertainty. If the crew could avoid heavily defended zones, they would. If they could aim for friendlier corridors of airspace, they would. The goal was not elegance, it was survival. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, the open front created a constant assault of cold and noise. Even at lower altitude, the wind was punishing. It cut through clothing. It numbed hands. It turned simple tasks, writing, adjusting a dial, handling equipment, into deliberate effort. The crew's stamina was being drained as surely as fuel. Fatigue is dangerous in aviation. Fatigue makes you sloppy. Sloppy makes you fast. Fast makes you break the airplane. The crew understood this and forced themselves to work methodically even as their bodies protested. Then another problem appeared. Debris. With the nose gone, fragments of metal, wiring, and insulation were exposed. Some pieces fluttered in the airflow like torn cloth. Others rattled against the frame. In a normal aircraft, debris stays contained. Here, debris could become a projectile inside the fuselage. It could strike instruments, cut a cable, or jam a moving part. Crew members secured what they could. They tied down loose material using whatever was available. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't ideal. But it reduced risk. Every small reduction mattered. At one point, the aircraft experienced another strong, buffeting event. The pilot felt the yoke shake in a way that suggested control response was being interfered with. The co-pilot shouted a warning. A crew member behind them reported that one of the exposed lines had begun to thrash again, worse than before. This was the nightmare scenario. Control lines not just exposed, but unstable. If they snapped, the pilot might lose elevator authority. If they jammed, the bomber could be locked into a dangerous attitude. The crew moved quickly, but carefully. They stabilized the line again as best they could. Hands braced, bodies anchored, movements controlled. The idea of holding an aircraft's nervous system steady with human strength sounds unbelievable. But in emergencies, unbelievable becomes routine. Up front, the pilot kept the bomber steady. He avoided rolling or turning while the crew worked, because turning would increase aerodynamic load and change how the lines moved. In other words, he flew to support their repair, even if it meant giving up optimal navigation temporarily. After several tense minutes, stability improved again. The bomber didn't become safe. It became manageable. The crew returned to their stations, breathing harder, hands aching, but alive. The radio operator continued searching for contact. In the air war, radio was hope. You might not get an escort. You might not get immediate rescue. But you could get information, direction, weather, landing availability. Even knowing that friendly airfields were within reach could change how a crew managed risk. Eventually, a usable signal came through. Not a perfect connection, but enough. The crew could now coordinate with friendlies, report their condition, and request landing priority. Hearing friendly voices didn't erase the danger, but it changed the psychology. They weren't alone in the sky anymore. Someone on the ground knew they were coming. Someone was preparing. But preparation on the ground did not solve the problem that remained in the air. A bomber with its front torn off still had to land. And landing would demand the same thing that kept them alive so far: precision, without panic. Part 5/8. The decision. Every crew fears. How do we land this? As friendly territory grew closer, the crew's focus shifted from, "Can we stay airborne?" to, "Can we put this aircraft on the ground without losing it?" That shift sounds natural, but it creates a new kind of pressure. In flight, you can keep correcting. On landing, the runway is finite. Time compresses. Mistakes become irreversible. The pilots began planning the approach long before they could see an airfield. They discussed runway length, wind direction, possible emergency options, and how the damaged aircraft might respond to landing configuration changes. Normally, you would adjust flaps, manage gear, stabilize speed, and follow a standard pattern. But the bomber's aerodynamic balance was no longer standard. Even something as basic as changing power could alter pitch in unpredictable ways, because airflow around the exposed structure had changed. Even gentle turns could trigger oscillations. So the pilots had to design a landing plan that minimized change. They requested the longest available runway. Long runway means you can land faster and stop more gradually. It gives you room to avoid hard braking and sudden corrections. In a damaged aircraft, gradual is survival. They also wanted a straight-in approach. No tight pattern, no steep turn to final. Just line up far out and keep it steady all the way in. That's how you land a fragile plane. You reduce the number of decisions, reduce the number of transitions, and keep the aircraft in its calmest state as long as possible. Ground personnel prepared emergency equipment. Fire crews stood by. Medical teams waited. But those preparations, while important, were distant to the crew. The pilots still had to fly the broken bomber onto the runway. Nobody could do it for them. As they approached the airfield, the pilot stabilized at a conservative speed and altitude. The co-pilot monitored airspeed like it was a lifeline. Too fast meant excessive stress. Too slow meant stall risk. Stall in a damaged bomber is not a gentle drop. It can become a snap, a roll, and a crash. The navigator helped line them up. The radio operator relayed instructions. The gunners remained vigilant, because even near friendly areas you never assumed safety until wheels were on the ground. Then the runway came into view. Under normal conditions, seeing a runway is relief. Here, it was almost a threat, a clear reminder that they had to do the one thing the aircraft might not tolerate. They needed to transition from flying to rolling. The pilot began configuring the aircraft. Gear was a major decision. If the landing gear failed to deploy properly, they could end in a crash landing. But belly landing a B-17 was extremely risky, even with an intact airframe. With the nose destroyed, any rough contact might cause unpredictable collapse or breakage. They deployed gear cautiously and verified status. The co-pilot confirmed indications. The crew listened. Any strange sound could mean a malfunction. Any unusual vibration could mean structural stress. Then came the glide slope. The pilot kept it shallow. A steep descent would require a strong flare, and strong flare would demand elevator authority they might not have reliably. A shallow glide meant longer time on final, but it also meant fewer aggressive control inputs. Wind conditions mattered. Crosswind landings require active rudder and aileron coordination. With controls compromised, crosswind could be deadly. If possible, they aligned with the runway direction that minimized crosswind. The aircraft descended slowly, the open front continuing to roar. The crew braced, not dramatically, but with the quiet readiness that comes from knowing you can't do anything except trust the pilots. As the bomber crossed the threshold, the pilot adjusted power carefully. A too rapid reduction could drop them hard. A too late reduction could make them float and overshoot. He aimed for controlled contact, not soft, not hard. Controlled. In the final seconds, the airplane felt like it was holding its breath. Then, the wheels touched. Part 6/8. Touchdown. Where survival can still fail. The instant the wheels met the runway, the bomber tried to do what damaged aircraft often do: drift, sway, and argue with the forces that suddenly changed. In the air, lift holds you up. On the ground, friction and uneven contact try to pull you sideways. A healthy aircraft counters this with stable aerodynamics and responsive controls. This bomber had neither in full. The pilot kept the yoke steady and made small corrections. The co-pilot assisted, calling out speed and runway alignment. They avoided sudden braking. They avoided aggressive rudder movement. The goal was not to stop quickly. The goal was to stay straight. A long runway gave them time. Time reduced pressure. Pressure leads to mistakes. The pilot used that runway like a resource, letting speed bleed off gradually. The aircraft shook as it rolled. The open front made it look unreal. A flying fortress turned into a half-finished skeleton. Ground crews watching from the side could hardly believe it was moving under control. It looked like something that should have crashed far away, not something rolling toward them on landing gear. Braking began gently. Too much brake can cause a skid. A skid can cause the aircraft to swing. A swing can collapse gear. Collapsed gear can flip the aircraft or tear it open. So the pilot applied brakes gradually, careful and consistent. The bomber continued to slow. The crew's breathing changed. Some men realized they had been holding tension in their bodies for hours. The moment the aircraft stayed straight on the runway, the moment it didn't swerve into disaster, people began to believe, quietly, that they might actually survive. When the aircraft finally slowed to a safe taxi speed, the pilot guided it toward a stopping area. Even this part required care. Turning off the runway demands steering input. Steering demands control. They made the turn with wide, gentle movement. Then the bomber stopped. For a moment, there was only wind and engine noise, and the sudden awareness of silence in the crew's voices. No one shouted victory. No one made a speech. They were too exhausted, too stunned, too aware of what almost happened. Ground crews rushed toward the aircraft, then slowed as they reached it, shocked by the scale of damage. The front end of the bomber was simply missing. Jagged edges, exposed framework, cables visible like veins. It was a miracle the aircraft hadn't disintegrated in the air, or collapsed on landing. But the crew had survived. As men climbed out, some were shaking, some were quiet. Some stared at the aircraft like it was a stranger. It's common after extreme